going to share. Thank you, Elise. Elise remembered that we needed to record the meeting. So I'm going to share a deck. Welcome, Sandra, to the meeting. We're going to be talking about what they call the second tenet of Conscious Capitalism, which is stakeholder orientation. And as you've heard me talk about, Sandra, in some of the other sessions, the order of them isn't necessarily important to remember. As you might recall, we talked about, higher purpose is typically, as the first tenet, is where is kind of an essential first tenet, because it drives how you will implement or how you will think about all of the other tenets. And I'll share a deck that will talk to you about that in just a moment. Just move some things around on my screen. Okay, so as we've talked about before, there is these four tenets, and we are moving through higher purpose, then stakeholder orientation, and then conscious leadership and conscious culture. And so we're going to go deep dive into stakeholder orientation today. All of these are super important, but I have to say stakeholder orientation is one of the ones that's my favorite to talk about, because it is fairly unique within conscious capitalism. And because one of the parts of the alphabet soup that we've talked about before, of all these different organizations doing lots of really important work in the conscious business space or the benefit economy space, is that one of the terms that's taken over most in sort of like the common language or the media is stakeholder capitalism. And so really, to understand stakeholder capitalism, you have to understand stakeholder orientation. And stakeholder capitalism and sort of thinking about your stakeholders is a really critical through line of all of the different ways that businesses or different organizations are proposing that business leaders practice some level of conscious business, stakeholder capitalism, participation in the benefit economy. So the stakeholder piece is really important to understand, and it is common terminology now, but kind of misunderstood a little bit. So we're going to do a deep dive into that. We have talked about, Sandra, when you've been here before, I think, that 2019 Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of a corporation. Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah. So 2019 feels like forever ago, but at this time, we hadn't had a global pandemic. And previous to the 2019, the Business Roundtable had always come out with a statement on the purpose of a corporation, which in the high level summary basically said it is to make money for your shareholders. That's the purpose. That's what we do. And some other language around, like, we want to be good for the world and do good things with their, and care for our customers and all that, the typical things that organizations know they have to say. But the Business Roundtable, as the biggest, largest, most powerful business lobbying group, consistently said, I think for 50 years, that the purpose of business was to make profit on behalf of your shareholders. And 2019 was the first time where they said that was different. That they said that it was to add value to your stakeholders. And it's the first time that the Business Roundtable is starting to use that language of stakeholder. You can see it comes up at the very end. It's the last word in this statement. So this is really interesting, kind of something to keep tabs on. Of course, they said this in August of 2019. The pandemic hit in early 2020. Businesses were tackling things that they'd never had to tackle before. And many did quite an admirable job of balancing the needs of the stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders being the community. I mean, many organizations, shut down their businesses for the health of their employees and health of the community. Like, we saw some of this play out for sure. But certainly there's a lot of scrutiny as well on this statement by the Business Roundtable, kind of to try to hold them accountable, like, to, you said you were going to do this, and what have you done? And that's still playing out a little bit. In particular, you can give them a slight pass on the fact that they were, these big businesses were dealing with a pandemic, and that was an unprecedented event. But we really want to see some accountability to what they're talking about here. And you can also, if you go to the Business Roundtable website, you can see how they're trying to make progress on this statement in some way, whether, it's up to everyone's own interpretation or decision as to whether they think that's enough progress. So we're starting that language shift from shareholder to stakeholder focus. Kind of a seminal event is this Business Roundtable statement, because it was this Business Roundtable is made up of the people that would always were insistent on the shareholder focus. So this is kind of a shift in our society. And you could also look at a number of articles to say like, well, why would the Business Roundtable do this? And you could, argue, well, they all are feeling as CEOs quite differently about what the purpose of business is. That's possible. I certainly wasn't involved directly in the room where they were making these decisions. So maybe that's possible. It's also very possible that they're understanding that the sentiment of consumers, their customers, and employees is significantly changing. And that is definitely supported by tons of research that people working in organizations or people buying from organizations are really thinking about that as a vote with your dollars or your time approach. And all of the data is really showing that people are willing to pay more for products that are built with a purpose or come from companies that do meaningful, valuable work to our society. And employees are much more likely, regardless of age, but certainly it gets, the numbers get pretty staggering as you go into younger generations, of insistent on meaningful, high value work that impacts society for the greater good. And so if you are a company that's thinking about, and maybe you're a traditional capitalist and you're thinking about like how you are going to make more money, you are going to run into issues with attraction and retention of talent and retention of customers if you're looking at that data and sort of not even having to read the tea leaves, because it's pretty clear where public sentiment is. And so that might be another motivation for coming out and sort of changing the statement on the purpose of a corporation. And so I think it's really important, no matter what, to spend time like sort of honoring this, because it really is important that this came out from the Business Roundtable, regardless of what's happened since then, that this language was starting to be introduced, and regardless of the reasons, that this was a huge issue, a huge notable event across the business community, not even the conscious business community, just across the business community. So it gave lots more discussion about what are we here to do as companies. And it goes back to the foundation of conscious capitalism, which is that we are really here to elevate humanity through business. And this directly talks about that. Okay, so then let's talk about a little bit more of the stakeholders. And this just is a little bit more of what they said in you can find this on the website. It's speaks to each of the stakeholders in the way that we really talk about it in conscious capitalism. So it's a great example of it practically applying in the real world. So stakeholders. So we generally know or talk about 3 stakeholders pretty easily within most companies. Sandra, what would you say are like the 3? Does anything come to mind for you that come to mind, like most companies?
Oh, yes. Well, so I think the biggest groups of those, and for me, stakeholders go far and wide beyond these 3, but I know the 3 biggest that we reference are employees, customers, and communities, of course. To me, those are big 3. And then, of course, environment and vendors and
okay, good. Yeah, you're right ahead. Yeah. So the ones that are talked about the most, and you have a very community-oriented organization, so I'm really not surprised you said community. But I think for most organizations, if you're thinking about what they're thinking about, you think about this from a startup perspective as well. This is what's most natural. Okay, we need employees, so we're going to think about our employees as stakeholders. We need customers, or we don't have any profit and can't actually survive. So let's focus on our stakeholders. And whoever owns us, whatever that ownership structure is, we need to think about our owners or our shareholders. Mm-hmm. So those 3 generally come very naturally in terms of stakeholders. The other ones that you mentioned, community, the environment, the earth, or our suppliers and vendors. In conscious capitalism are the other three that we say are the baseline stakeholders that you would ever be thinking about. And so those are sometimes new for people to be considering. Community, as you said, often comes in, often more with the idea of the sort of phrase, giving back to the community, which is a little bit of a different relationship than what we're going to be talking about here. So when we'll get to that in just a moment. And then earth, it might be something that we think about related to, like, do we shut the lights off in our organization, or do we think about lessening our carbon footprint? And those are, again, things that we think about after as the outcomes of things that we're doing, or maybe to give back or make up for things that we're doing, which is, again, a little bit different than what we're talking about. So some of the things around community and environment or the earth are, or even vendors and suppliers, because that sometimes comes up around vendor or supplier diversity, are usually things that we're thinking about from a corporate social responsibility perspective or a corporate responsibility perspective, and are not embedded or deeply ingrained into the business strategy, but are things that we do to make up for the impact of our business strategy. Does that make sense, Sandra?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really important to distinguish, because it comes up a lot, and I get questioned by a lot of people, understandably, that it's confusing of, well, how is stakeholder orientation different from corporate social responsibility or corporate responsibility? Because we have corporate responsibility at my company.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to talk about that a little bit coming up. So the key thing that we're considering in stakeholders is, who are they? And we just identified them in some broad buckets. Often with my clients, I'll often ask them to think about their competitors as stakeholders as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so you won't see that always as a natural bucket. And depending on the industry, you also may have other types of stakeholders. So we're only just naming the top 6 most obvious that we would say apply to every company. But there certainly may be other stakeholders in addition to those. And the competitor piece is really interesting to think about, because one of the most powerful aspects of stakeholder orientation is the innovation that can come from it. And when you think about your competitors as stakeholders, as a different type of relationship, that might initiate some different levels of innovation. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. And then, so what you're doing as a conscious capitalist in a company that's practicing conscious capitalism is that you're first starting with, who would you consider your stakeholders in those 6 buckets that we talked about? And then assessing, like, what do we think our relationship is with the current stakeholders? And some organizations know very well what their relationship is with their customers. They might be doing NPS scores or all sorts of things that analyze that. They know that inside and out. They might be doing an engagement survey or a sentiment survey with their employees, and they kind of know that. But they may not be doing anything around the community, the earth, or their suppliers and vendors to check in about the strength or health of those relationships. Or might not even be thinking about, what are we doing to actually nurture and cultivate those relationships to begin with? So that's kind of a starting point of thinking about that more broadly. So we've been through these 6 types of stakeholders, and you'll hear in conscious capitalism, it alternatively talked about as society or community. So whichever word you use is perfectly okay. And as we've talked about, you can add competitors or other things based on the industry. What's really important to think about is that when you're approaching business from the traditional sense, if you looked at these 6 stakeholders, how you might approach it from a traditional business sense is that in order to be better to our employees, in whatever way you define that, we have to be worse to our customers or to our suppliers. So in order to provide this benefit to our employees, we have to increase the price to our customers or get a lower price from our suppliers. In order to make more money for our investors, we have to pay our employees lower wages or less benefits. In order to be great, really good for the environment, we have to provide packaging to our customers that they don't like. So all of that is trade-off thinking. It's saying, in order to do better for one stakeholder, we have to do worse for another. And what you say in conscious capitalism is that we reject trade-off thinking altogether, which is actually why I think stakeholder orientation is the most interesting and fun part of this is because trade-off thinking is really ingrained and programmed into our society and into the way that we do business. So it's a big challenge for organizations to be thinking about, not from a scarcity trade-off mentality, but from an abundance mentality, that we can actually figure out how to add value to all of these stakeholders. And that's the key. How do you add value to all of the stakeholders rather than having to trade off amongst them for value? And Sandra, jump in at any time if you have questions, and Elise too. I know you've heard this too before, Elise. So that's the kind of crux of the stakeholder orientation piece, is that adding value to all of your stakeholders is what you are attempting to do, and attempting to do that through abundance thinking. And that's where the innovation comes, because the innovation comes from, if you're thinking about it from an abundancy perspective, and you're trying to add value to all of these stakeholders, and you're taking the time to get to know them and build relationships with them in order to understand what value actually means to them. Because that's a piece you don't know, or you might assume you know. And I know, many executive teams that might assume they know what value means to each of the stakeholders. But in conscious capitalism, that means that you are having an ongoing deep relationship that's very intentional with your stakeholders to find out what value means to them related to your business. And then in a more advanced way of thinking about it, and advanced on the journey of conscious capitalism company would be bringing in stakeholders that represent each of these different stakeholder groups and asking for their input on key business decisions to better understand, based on that decision, what is valuable to that particular stakeholder. So it really starts, the journey starts with looking at your stakeholder map, identifying who the stakeholders are, assessing how healthy those relationships are, determining your plan to deepen those relationships, all the way to the point where when you're making key business decisions, or determining what your business strategy is, you're incorporating your stakeholders and their diversity of thinking and their diversity of value to determine how you add value to all of them. And that's proven to be a more successful way to do business and more profitable way to do business. In particular, because if you're involving your stakeholders, what we know happens is they have a real vested interest then in your success. And we saw this play out in the pandemic in a huge way, where when organizations already had this stakeholder orientation, which they might not have called it that, but they might not even know about conscious capitalism, but you saw this play out where organizations really had a value of working closely with their stakeholders, and treated their suppliers as they would treat their customers, and thought about their suppliers as a member of their family, as an example. Or when they went in their communities, they were so respected in their communities as a member of that community. That business was a key member of the community, that when those businesses were struggling, their stakeholders would come to help them, because the stakeholders wanted those businesses to succeed. And so in great times, this works well, but in hard times, it works even better, because you have tons more allies to help you figure out how to get, to sort of weather the storm, because they care about whether your business survives. They're getting value from your business being there. Whereas for the most, in many organizations, if your business went away, the customers might just find something different. There's not a key differentiator to how you're doing your business or the way they feel about your business. So that doesn't matter so much to them. Or the suppliers might be like, well, that's okay, because I can get a better deal going to another customer. I don't have a deep relationship with that particular company. And so it doesn't matter to me that they're not going to survive through this difficult time. Whereas if you have it on the other side where they really care, then the customers are coming saying, what can we do to help you to survive? Or the suppliers are saying, well, maybe for this piece, maybe for this shipment, we can cut the costs and figure out a different way to do it to allow you to get through this difficult time. That's what happens. And we saw many stories of that happening over the course of the pandemic. So any questions about any of that so far?
Yeah.
It seems like it's resonating with you, Sandra. Is it because you've seen it actually playing out in organizations you've worked with one way or the other, like that?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing for me that we certainly see and do our best to identify is the way you were talking about the relationships of one to another, is figuring out how do you drive value from one to another to create abundance. And that's always the tricky part, but that to me is something we certainly, it resonates the most, I think.
Yeah, that's
We
so
can
good,
drive
because
that,
there's
yeah.
huge magic in doing that. And I think, again, it's all like, where are you on the process? But a lot of companies, of course, will start with they're building relationships individually with these different stakeholder groups. And then eventually, when you can get them together and then start to together talk about what's value to them, then they come up with the solution that the company never would have even thought of. And that, that's where it can evolve. Because it is as you said, it's super tricky, and it's not, we shouldn't discount that it's a lot to manage all these different stakeholders and figure out how to pay attention to them and make sure you understand the value. Like it's something that you have to very deliberately do and resource appropriately as well, but has a huge payoff. So I think, this part is fairly obvious, and we kind of highlighted it just briefly around why it is that these different groups would be stakeholders. And I think probably what's most interesting, because it's the most different thinking from what we typically see, is on the suppliers piece. Thinking about how to treat your suppliers fairly and helping them survive and flourish, as it talks about here, and including them in the values and purpose as you're bringing them on into the organization. Like, what's your supplier onboarding process? If you were to think about the way you have a customer onboarding process and an employee onboarding process, what is that for suppliers? We kind of have this mentality in traditional business that suppliers are there to serve the organization that they are supplying, as opposed to the organization serving the supplier in some way. So it's a little bit of a reverse way of thinking that can deepen that partnership. And really, as that points out, having a partnership mindset as opposed to, it's a vendor type of scenario. And then the same is true on the investor side. And we talk a lot about in Conscious Capitalism that if you're clear on the higher purpose and you really thought about your stakeholders, and investors or owners or shareholders are a critical piece of your stakeholder group, how can you attract the aligned investors, owners, or shareholders to your organization so that there is less work that has to be done to add value or make meaning for that group? Because you can imagine, if you're trying to practice as a conscious business leader and you're thinking about, you have a long-term orientation and you're trying to add value to all of these stakeholders, and you have a bunch of investors that look at the definition of business traditionally, as the Business Roundtable have done in the past, and said, you're in business to make money for the shareholder, and I'm a shareholder and I want my money and I want a short-term orientation. There's constant friction there. And so what we're trying to do is make more alignment from the very beginning and be very deliberate about that. And many organizations struggle with the environment stakeholder just because it's pretty amorphous. Like, how do you bring the earth to the table and ask the earth, like, what does it need from the business? And so this one, you do have to get creative, but often not too creative, in that there is, depending on the industry or the business of a company, there is often a community representative that is more of an expert on an environmental issue that is linked to that company, that could be brought in to do some education or brought in as an environmental stakeholder. And so it might be, if you're a products and services company. Are you at a bank, Sandra? Am I remembering that right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So with banking, thinking about what is the most environmental impact, what's the most part of your business or products and services where the environment is impacted? I guess, do you know that off the top of your head? Like, or what would you say?
I don't, but I think, I guess it depends on how you would look at that. But off the top of my head, we could just use facilities as an example. That would be any impact as an outcome of that, or travel, or,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So yeah, and it's a great example, because every company often would have facilities, travel, products like office supplies
Mhm.
as like the baseline things that they probably need to operate,
Mhm.
that have environmental consequences or implications. And so then it's thinking about, okay, in those buckets, who do we have as experts that could help educate us about how to responsibly think about travel in a different way, or think about office supplies in a different way? Do we have a supplier relationship with an office supplies company that we could say we want to have them only bring in a certain level of product for us, as an example? Or in our facilities, do we have anybody in our facilities that are paying attention to our carbon footprint of our facilities? And if not, what can we do about that? Do we hire an expert? Do we bring in someone that's at a local community group or at a nonprofit that does that type of work, and they help us understand what value means in this space and how we can have less of an impact or add more value to the earth? So that would be how you would tackle the environment. And then for some companies, yeah, if you're in a manufacturing environment, like that's a much, sometimes easier way to think about, like they often know exactly what they might need to do to lessen environmental risk, and they would be able to hire experts to help them address that in a very deliberate way. This slide just gives some examples of stakeholder maps that are pretty high level, but you can kind of begin to see the different even language that different companies would use. That, we're using very, basic language around customers and employees, but Studio Movie Grill talks about it as their guests and their team members and their communities and their vendor partners and their investors, and they are thinking about all of those at the same time. So something's different on Andrews, that's a beer company, and then Satori Capital is an investment company. So you can see it's just about giving thought to, and you can see that they, in the investment company, they have the government as one of their stakeholders, and that's something that's not in the core listing, but very specific to what the work is that they do. Some other examples. So this is really indicative of where you would start with doing the stakeholder map. These are really high level stakeholder maps. What you would then do after determining these general stakeholder maps, and these look very pretty, they certainly don't have to look like that. They could be on a piece of paper that's written at somebody's desk, but then it's a list of actual names underneath each of like, who are they specifically? Because those, each of these categories is made up of a whole bunch of people that will need to be engaged in some way or have discussions with in some way. So like interesting to see that for Stagen, fellow travelers is one of theirs based on their industry. And for First United, everybody is pictures in my way. Yeah, First United. It's they talk about it as partners, but we don't know how they define that because that's very internal to them. Mm-hmm. So just cool to see some different examples of that. And then so it's how to create your stakeholder map. And normally, Sandra, we might do a little exercise in the group, but since it's only you and Elise, we'll probably allow you to just do that at your own time. It's really that method of the first method of taking each of the stakeholder buckets that we've talked about, and then under each write out the individuals that are coming to mind, the individuals or companies that are coming to mind. And that's a fun exercise to do certainly on your own, but then to ask others who else would they think of, because then it starts to really create like a relationship map of how you can start to think about your assessment of those relationships. And then this just gives you another idea of if you were doing that in a group, and you could certainly do that individually too. Sometimes it's helpful to think about it from the original stakeholder buckets, but sometimes it's helpful to generate it kind of backwards in a way of what are the people or organizations, and then you can bucket them into the different stakeholder buckets if you did like it through Post-it notes. So it might be what I often encourage leaders to do, even if they're not doing this across their organization, doing it within a department or function, and just saying like, who are our stakeholders in this department? And that can be a mix of internal and external stakeholders. And it can be a really good exercise to do, just to think about even customer orientation. Like how are we thinking most broadly about who our customers are? In our regular definition of customers, which I'm sure is like your banking customers, but many organizations, internal departments have other customers internal to them that they need to get things to in order to make things happen? And how do you think about those individuals as stakeholders? Does that all make sense to you?
Mhm.
Okay. So this talks about creating that rough sketch of the stakeholder map. And then this is kind of the assessment piece of, once you have that list, then you can go and think about, well, what is the main need, as far as I understand it at this moment, of each of those stakeholders? And then what is the current strategy that we have for interaction and relationship building with that stakeholder? Some of that might be really well thought out, depending on the business, and some of that might be just beginning to think about it. And we do have a tool, and Sandra, you might be really interested in checking this out because you're so interested in this and conscientious about coming to these sessions. There's something called the skates. If you go to a site called stakeholderscore.com, there is a assessment there that gives businesses a tool to assess how they're doing with their stakeholder relationships in the way that we're defining them here. And that's a tool that is being used and is being piloted by many organizations now as a way to assess the strength of stakeholder relationships. And so that really does help with step 3, which is, which stakeholder relationship could you improve? You may inherently know that. Many businesses do. Like, it's pretty obvious if you didn't even think about the earth or the environment as a stakeholder before doing this, that's probably an opportunity to improve. Sometimes organizations have been working on their customer relationships for a long time, but they don't actually know what they could improve, and they need to go out and figure that out by talking to their customers, or using a tool like the stakeholder score, like I mentioned. And then, of course, with any exercise, there's the prioritization of it. So it's that last question of, you can't work on strengthening all of your stakeholder relationships at the same time. That's just too much. So which one would have the greatest impact if it was strengthened now? Which one do you have the most, the least visibility to what it is really, what value really looks like to them? Or which stakeholder do you struggle with the most in terms of the relationship that you need to invest more time and interest in building that, and maybe a focus on the relationship with an abundance mindset instead of a trade-off mindset. So it's a really fun, really interesting exercise to be able to think about those stakeholder relationships. And it always, regardless of if you end up with a really particular plan, it usually always yields something coming into more consciousness and changing the way that you're approaching a relationship. So then, of course, you need to know the needs of each of the stakeholders. And the part of this exercise is like, and this is all, I think, fairly straightforward, is that you might think the needs, but important to verify that, and important to hear about that even from the perspectives of people within your own group, like, because they all have different interactions with your stakeholders. So talking about what you think the needs of the stakeholders is often really rich discussion. And this is really the crux of it, is what in Conscious Capitalism we talk about as the win-win-win. You might hear it about, or win 6, because of the 6 different stakeholders. So this goes back to the mentality, the abundance mentality over the trade-off mentality, is that it's not a win-lose proposition. It's that everyone is going to win, because that's the value add piece that we're talking about. And what that's really, of course, testing is, there will be times when, at least at first blush, it seems like the stakeholders are at odds with each other, or there is a conflict between what they want. And often the only way that you can resolve that is to have the stakeholders be talking with each other to better understand their needs. So this is really advanced. There's rarely organizations that are doing this at like the fully mature level. But we know that we can get there as a society, as a business society. And we also know that there is often a lot of common ground that does not get clarified or sort of pulled out in the discussions initially. So while we might approach it as a conflict, because we might be thinking about it from a trade-off mentality, there is probably more common ground than conflict amongst stakeholders. And so to try to figure out what that common ground is first, and then determine where there may be a conflict and ask for their help in solving it, that has been very successful in businesses. So the thing that I want to mention, I think I'm going to exit out of this for a moment, because I think we kind of covered all that. The thing to mention about stakeholder orientation, going back to the corporate responsibility piece that we were talking about earlier, is that trade-off versus abundance mentality is really critical when you're thinking about giving back. So our common way of getting involved or engaged with the community as businesses is that we think about, we're going to do our business strategy, we're going to do whatever our work is that we need to get done. And then if there's something that we need to do to make up for that, like give more money to charity or make sure that we have done a cleanup day at the beach, or that we've given our employees an extra bonus for working a lot of extra time off. Like, it's always, we get to the outcome and then we're reactive with an action to make up for or give back. That's kind of the common formula. Does that sound familiar to you, Sandra?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what that actually doesn't do is get to the root cause of most issues and most systemic change that we're trying to initiate. So we can think about it as the companies that do really good things, in that they may provide, think about it as a food pantry or a soup kitchen, or companies that ship clothing overseas to third world countries. They're addressing an immediate need, that people are hungry or need clothing or need shelter. But they're not addressing often the reason why people don't have food, clothing, or shelter. They're just addressing the symptoms of the problem, but not the root cause. And that's kind of the way you can think about stakeholder orientation, if it's done really well, is that you're embedding your stakeholder orientation into the way that you do the business. And so the community and the environment and your suppliers, to use those three examples that are the most often forgotten ones, are included in your business decision making, rather than an afterthought of how are we going to treat them well if things go well with our business strategy. And so it's, instead of having corporate social responsibility or diversity, equity, and inclusion sitting as separate programs or separate initiatives outside of the executive team that are usually like relegated to someone else to figure out, it's that those issues and those stakeholders are represented in the executive team, in the business decision making at all times. And that's, I'm talking about advanced, and that's what we're all aspiring to do. But it would be the CEO being so understanding and familiar with the value add of all of the stakeholders, that as decisions are being made, that CEO can really accurately and authentically represent those stakeholders, but also that CEO is welcoming the stakeholders into the business decision making, or calling them saying, hey, we're making a decision on opening up a new part of our facility, and we really need help thinking about how to think about lighting and the environmental impact of making this extension and like all those things. Can you come in and help us? You already have that relationship. You already can make that call, and you're confident that you can add value with each other as you're doing that initiative, as one example of a stakeholder. So it really is forcing us all to think at a little bit, or sometimes a lot more, at a systemic level of, people still need, from a community perspective, to be fed and housed and made sure that, they have clothing. But we will always be in the business of having to do that unless we go more to the root cause issue. And that's how we should be thinking about it from a business perspective too, is from a root cause issue, how do we bring the stakeholders in so they can help us solve some of those root cause issues? And that's where the innovation really comes from as well. So I'm just going to pause. That's kind of all like the major meat of stakeholder orientation and the difference between it and corporate social responsibility. And if you haven't read Conscious Capitalism, the book, Sandra, you would, I'm sure, really enjoy it. And there's actually like a really good section in there that John Mackey and Raj Sisodia talk about why conscious capitalism, but really more stakeholder orientation, is different from corporate social responsibility in the ways that we've been talking about here.
Yep. Yep. So I do have that book and I'm slowly making my way through it. I also actually just got there's this really neat field guide that we also stumbled across that put just a little, basic. So, yes, exactly. So that's been a very cool thing to just be able to also see some of the frameworks, and they encourage you just to kind of think about that. So that's been a cool thing to take a look at. One question that I had was about suppliers, and there's always this question, and I can't remember if I read it in the book or not, but it had made me wonder how people do this. But I certainly understand all of the partnering with thinking about your suppliers as partners. I think it's a very different, neat idea. We're always about, onboarding of customers and onboarding of employees. And so in this case, you referenced, supplier onboarding, which I thought that's really a different take. So that's interesting. My question though, is a little bit on the reverse side of that. As I know that there is, or I've heard, I guess I should say, talk about how conscious businesses can influence vendors and suppliers in a way that says, do you even measure or hold them accountable, or of social, environmental, DEI? I don't know what the examples would be, but those types of practices. And so what is it that other companies have done in that area? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I'd first say before many companies will start to try to hold their suppliers and vendors accountable to some of the things that you just mentioned on measurements or metrics on either particular environmental standards, delivery or service standards, which is usually where it starts, and then potentially demographics, DEI types of metrics. What I would say is a conscious business would first be holding themselves accountable to all of those things before they're asking anyone else.
Right.
So, and that doesn't often happen, actually. I'm not saying within conscious,
that makes sense.
I'm just saying in businesses in general, it's like, oh, let's ask them for all these things as a part of our corporate social responsibility story. But then if they're asked the same, they can't, get an A on their own test, so to speak. So that would be the first step, is like figuring out what do you want to hold yourself accountable to, and getting as much, advanced on that as possible. And then going to your suppliers to have conversations about what's important to you as an organization and how you have actually been working on that for some period of time, and that you want to partner with organizations that have similar values and approaches to the business as you. And then having a real discussion in a partnership way of like, here's what we think some of the metrics or some of the accountability should be, and let's talk through that. And that's so much more of a real discussion, in that the company at that point has already gone through their own process to try to meet those metrics, and knows that it's not necessarily easy, or that some are more difficult than others, and can really coach and partner and mentor suppliers to try to meet those standards in a reasonable way. So it's more, you're collaborating to say like, this is what we've chosen for us internally, and we would really like to partner with vendors that are suppliers and that can do this. What does that look like for you? Is that possible? What's the time frame that looks like? What's the agreement that we'd have on when we're going to follow up on this to make sure that we're all on track? How can we help you with achieving these goals? And so it's more of a conversation. Now, at some point, it's kind of like anything. At some point, if there really does seem to be a misalignment, and that supplier is really not going to meet the standards, then that's an opportunity to examine the partnership overall. Maybe that's just not a good stakeholder to include in the organization. But that's how a conscious business would be approaching it, is really truly partnership of how do we do this together, and how do we keep each other accountable. And then at some point, that accountability has to lead to decision-making around, is there a misalignment in the relationship? Does that answer the question? Does that make sense?
Very much so.
Okay, great.